In that part of that panorama that concerns itself with the American Revolution and its consequences, the writings of Gordon S. Wood are among the most highly esteemed. A brief list of his major publications has been distributed to you, but could well have been augmented with a long list of the many prizes they have captured, including the Bancroft Prize, the Pulitzer Prize, and the American History Book Prize. For his many contributions as an author, lecturer, and teacher, chiefly at Brown University, where he is University Professor Emeritus, Gordon Wood was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama in 2010. In what he has referred to as my 2 seconds of fame, he is also mentioned in one of the scenes in the movie Good Will Hunting, where the Townie character, played by Matt Damon, takes down a snotty Harvard student in a verbal bar fight. It's wicked funny. Tonight he will share with us his own thoughts about the role that history plays in our collective experience. In the publicity for his talk, we asked whether philosopher George Santayana was correct when he said that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I never see that quote without being reminded of a funny mistake made by a student journalist at the University of Texas who misattributed it to the Mexican general who prevailed at the Alamo but was soundly defeated thereafter at the Battle of San Jacinto, and of course that was General Santa Anna. So I'm certain that one lesson that history teaches us is the importance of getting one's facts right. I'll leave it to Professor Wood to opine more fully on the question posed by his title, Does History Teach Lessons? Please join me in welcoming him to the microphone.
It's a great pleasure to be back here in the Burns Society in this magnificent library, and of course the greatest collection of early Americana in the world. So it's just a magnificent institution. Now, to answer my question, does history teach lessons? I think this is an old question, you know, that involved a lot of agonizing thought over the years. And the short answer I have to it is no. I don't believe that history teaches us any particular lessons. Now, this is probably not a conventional view. Most of us assume that history teaches lessons, and the prevalence of that Santayana quote, phrase, you know, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, I think suggests how prevalent that view is. I'm taking the contrary view. In fact, I remember Secretary of State Dean Rusk testifying before Congress in the early 1960s, saying that we had to intervene in Vietnam. He said, remember the lesson of Munich. If we don't take a stand now, all will be lost. So given that kind of thinking, I think you can make a better case for the opposite of Santayana's point of view. Those who remember the past are the ones condemned to repeat it. At any rate, I don't believe that we can easily extract from the past any particular lessons to guide our future behavior. Insofar as history teaches us any lessons, I think it teaches only one big one, that nothing ever works out quite the way the people in the past intended. In fact, I would go so far as to say, I don't know of any major event in the history of the world that turned out quite as its participants expected. Or maybe a better way of putting this is to say that we should not think about history in this way, as a source of maxims or lessons that we can apply to the present or to the future. Maybe that's what political scientists do or sociologists do, but it's not what historians do, or at least they ought not to be doing it. They ought not to be using history as a source of lessons. Our emphasis on history teaching us lessons is, I think, just another expression of our historyless culture. Despite all the history books that are published every year, over 1,000 a year, I think, I don't believe that we Americans are a very history-minded people. Our eyes are on the future, not on the past, or at least they used to be. It was President Polk who, I think, said that the United States was the only nation that had its history in the future. By disparaging the capacity of history to teach us lessons, however, I don't mean to suggest that studying the past can't teach us anything. If history has nothing to say to us, then it wouldn't make much sense to study it, to read it, or teach it. What I want to do this evening is explain something of what I believe history is and why I think it's important to us and what effect knowledge of the past ought to have on our consciousness, on our culture, on our sense of ourselves. Now, I spent my whole career studying the revolution and its leaders. I've been asked more than once by many, many people, what did I learn from writing about these revolutionary leaders, these founders, as we call them? Now, I guess what strikes me most after researching and writing about this founding era for all these decades is the extent to which these great men, and we recognize they are great men, these founders, the extent to which they were plagued by illusions. They were smart men, we know that, but they did not know their future any more than we know our future. All of the founders who lived into the 19th century, all of them died deeply disillusioned with what they had wrought. The society became much more democratic, much more popular, much more vulgar than they had expected. They had many illusions when they went into this revolution. They never expected political parties to develop, for example. They hated parties. Nevertheless, parties emerged and nearly tore the country apart. They thought that the educated likes of them would dominate the future government, men who had been to Harvard or Princeton. But more often than not, especially in the North, they discovered by the first decade of the 19th century that too many clodhoppers, like Simon Snyder of Pennsylvania, became governors of their states. And they became so by ridiculing college-educated elites and by wearing their lack of a college degree and their humble origins as badges of honor. Many of the founders thought that they could deal with the native peoples, the Indians, in a humane and respectful manner. They thought that the settlement of the West could be controlled and made orderly. Henry Knox's letters to Washington in the 1790s are scrupulous in their concern with maintaining the natives' culture. And they're such that I think even a modern anthropologist might applaud Knox's views. But Washington and Knox could not control the massive surges of people who crossed the Appalachians in increasing numbers. These ordinary white settlers who moved west were flushed with the confidence that they were indeed the chosen people of God, that their leaders told them they were, and they paid no attention whatsoever to the plans and policies concocted in eastern capitals. They went ahead and rapidly and chaotically scattered westward, and they stirred up warfare with the Indians, into which the federal government was inevitably drawn. Many of the founders also thought that slavery would die a natural death, would simply wither away in time. Although slavery was put on the road, as you know, to extinction in the northern states, slavery actually expanded in the southern states. Now, the founders could not have been more wrong about the future of slavery. But there was misleading evidence in the 1780s and 90s that slavery in the Upper South was declining. Virginia in particular, since Virginia was the biggest state, the richest, the most populous, as Virginia went, so went the nation, and Virginia was taking steps to abolish slavery. In the aftermath of the Revolution, there were more anti-slave societies in Virginia than in the North. Now, the most graphic example I can give you of their optimism, these Virginia planners, was that in 1791, the College of William and Mary gave an honorary degree to Granville Sharp, who was the leading British abolitionist at the time. I don't think there's any more graphic indication of just how optimistic they were that slavery was on its way out. This expectation, of course, that slavery was on its last legs was their greatest illusion. They had many other illusions about the future, too. As late as 1821, Thomas Jefferson thought that there was not a young man now alive who would not die a Unitarian. Unitarian, what was he thinking? I mean, this is at a time when the Baptists and the Methodists, the evangelical groups, were sweeping the country, and he thinks they're all going to become Unitarians. But before we become arrogant and condescending towards these people in the past, We should realize that we too live with illusions, only we don't know what they are. It strikes me that every generation lives with illusions, different ones for each generation, and that's, in a sense, how history proceeds. A series of illusions, one generation after another. History could be called a record of exploded illusions. Each generation set of illusions gets demolished or discredited and replaced by a new set. And in some sense, that's what the historical process is about. Take a look, for example, at Franklin Roosevelt's Commonwealth Club speech, made in 1932 during the campaign for the presidency at Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. You can call it up on your internet. It's full of a sense of limitations. It's full of Frederick Jackson Turner, the closing of the frontier, the end of free land. America's come to an end. He talks about limitations everywhere. The pie has stopped growing, he says. Our job now is to divide up equitably this fixed pie. That was the program, as he saw it, for the New Deal. He couldn't have been more wrong, as we know. Most economists thought that after the end of World War II, that we would go back to the same economic status that we had during the 1930s. No one, as far as I know, predicted the kind of bonanza that took place in the 1950s. I think we have to face the fact that people in the past scarcely knew what was happening to them. And I think that's true of us today as well. I don't think we really know what's going on. It's an interesting question to ask students. Who knows more about the past, the people who lived through it, or the historians writing about it 200 years later? I think the historians know more about it than the people who lived through it. Now, once we approach the historical process in this way, we become aware of just how much the participants in the past were victims as well as drivers of the historical process. We come to realize that these participants were limited by forces that they did not understand or even were aware of. Forces such as demographic movements, economic developments, large-scale cultural patterns. The drama, indeed, I think the tragedy of history comes from our understanding of the tension that existed between the conscious wills and intentions of the participants in the past and the underlying conditions that constrained their actions and shaped their future. Realizing the extent to which people in the past struggled with circumstances that they scarcely understood, I think is perhaps the most important insight flowing from historical study. To understand the past and all its complexity is to acquire wisdom and humility, and indeed, a tragic sense of life. Now, a tragic sense of life does not mean a sad or a pessimistic sense of life. It means a sense of the limitations of life. History is thus like experience and old age. Wisdom is what one learns from it. For young people, history is a shortcut way of acquiring the wisdom of old age. In my opinion, this makes history a supremely humanistic discipline, maybe the queen of the humanities. It may not teach us particular lessons, but it does tell us how we might live in the world. A sense of the limitations of life is not deterministic, and it does not deny the individual's responsibility for his or her actions. Indeed, by making people aware of the circumstances impinging on it and limiting them, the historical sense makes true freedom and moral choice and wisdom possible. All the great tragic novelists of the 19th century, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, Henry James, wrote, I think, with this kind of deep historical sense. Now, some historians do too. Drew Faust, the historian and president of Harvard, in her superb book entitled Mothers of Invention, Women of the Slaveholding South in the American Civil War, which was published in 1996, I think nicely captures this, what I mean by this complicated and tragic sense of tragic character of history. What she hoped to do in her book, which is about the lives of slaveholders who experienced the freeing of their slaves by the war, what she hoped to do, she says, was to give a sense of how people are shaped and constrained by the world into which they are born. Quoting here, of how their choices are limited by the taken-for-grantedness of their social universe. Faust writes that she wanted to show, quoting here too, wanted to show how hard it is to cope with change, to adjust to a new world, even to a world that to us seems unquestionably more morally and socially desirable, and to show how people managed not just to accept, but to justify social arrangements we today find abhorrent. Now, to be able to see the participants of the past in this comprehensive way, to see them in the context of their own time, to describe their blindness and folly with sympathy, to recognize the extent to which they were caught up in changing circumstances over which they had little control, and to realize the degree to which they created results that they never intended. To know all this about the past and to be able to relate it without anachronistic distortion to our present is what is meant, at least in my mind, is what is meant by having a historical sense. To possess a historical sense does not mean simply to possess information about the past. It means to have a different consciousness, a historical consciousness, to have incorporated into our minds a special mode of understanding that profoundly influences the way we look at the world. History, I think, adds another dimension to our view of the world and enriches our experience. Someone with a historical sense sees reality differently, in 4 dimensions, if you will. Now, we've heard a lot over the past several decades about the cultural construction of reality, the so-called postmodern sense that the world is made by us. Now, historians, I think, have little quarrel with this notion of the cultural construction of reality, as long as it is understood as the historical construction of reality. Too often, postmodernists think that by demonstrating the cultural construction of reality, they have made it easier for men and women to change that reality at will. If culture and society are made by us, they imply, they can be remade to suit our needs, or so it seems. But anyone with a historical sense knows differently, knows that things are more complicated than that. History, experience, custom, developments through time give strength and solidity to the conventions and values by which we live our lives. These conventions, these values, however humanly created, are not easily manipulated or transformed. They, of course, have changed and will continue to change, but not necessarily in the ways that we intend or want. We are not as free from the past as we think we are. Knowing this is to have a historical sense. As Faulkner, who had a acute historical sensibility, said, the past isn't even past. Now, such a historical sense is especially good for taking us off what I would call the roller coaster of illusions and disillusions, of extremes of emotions, that these are the best of times or the worst of times. It also tends to inhibit foolish decisions by our political leaders. Now, the eminent scholars, Richard Neustadt and Ernest May, in their book, Thinking in Time, published 1986, quite a while ago, but what they tried to do in that book was show how history might be used by government decision makers. Very ambitious book. They ended up, after 250 pages or so, concluding that the most that history could teach governmental leaders is prudence and cautiousness, which may not be a bad thing in today's world. Historical sense may not teach us particular lessons, but it does give us perspective on what is possible, and more important, I think, what is not possible. Above all, such a sense tends to undermine that crude, utilitarian, present-minded use of the past that is characteristic of many American historians. Too many historians today want to make history useful to their particular present-minded cause, whatever that cause may be. Many of them have what I would call an instrumentalist view of history. They want to manipulate the past for the sake of the present. One distinguished historian of Native Americans several years ago made this aim very explicit. He wrote that he sees the historian's role as that of being a critic of the culture, whose principal task is to illuminate conditions of the present by casting a harsh light on previous experience. By describing, for example, the sly and brutal ways early American whites treated the Indians, this historian wanted his students, as he put it, to learn unpleasant lessons from their study of the past. Now, rather than trying to understand the past in its own terms, these kinds of present-minded historians want the past to be immediately relevant and useful. They want to use history to empower people in the present, to help them develop self-identity, or to enable them to break free of that past. I have a graphic example of what I'm talking about. experience that happened to me quite a few years ago. In 1989, I gave a lecture at the Library of Congress commemorating the 200th anniversary of the founding of the Congress. Although my lecture was solely about this first Congress, during the question period, a very angry woman rose and asked, "Why don't you historians of the founders give proper credit to the Iroquois in the creation of the Constitution?" Well, I was surprised by the question because I had never heard of the Iroquois' involvement in the making of the Constitution. Now, I suppose I should have been aware of it because that previous fall, in October of 1988, the House of Representatives and the Senate passed resolutions thanking the Iroquois for their contribution to the framing of the U.S. Constitution. The Congress would pass anything if it might win some votes. Now, the angry woman was Laura Nader. She's the sister of Ralph Nader. And she's a professor, or was then at least a professor of anthropology at Berkeley. She was so infuriated by what these founders had done in neglecting the Iroquois that she wrote a letter to the Librarian of Congress, James Billington, enclosing an article by another anthropologist and suggesting that Billington, and quote here, "send this to Wood and educate him in the origins of the Constitution." So Billington sent the article on to me. Now, this is roughly how the anthropologist argument went. It gives you an idea of the sense of causality that some anthropologists have. Benjamin Franklin was at the Albany Conference in 1754, where he, of course, suave diplomat that he was, congratulated the Iroquois on their ability to bring 5 tribes together to form their confederacy, their Iroquois nation. Then 3 decades later, at the Constitutional Convention, 1787, Franklin presumably passed this idea of federalism on to his fellow delegates at Philadelphia. And in this manner, the Iroquois influenced the creation of the present federal system. Now, although there's not a shred of historical evidence for this claim, the fact that it might raise the self-esteem of Native American students is sufficient justification, for some scholars at least, that it be taught. Even the distinguished sociologist Nathan Glazer suggested that the myth might be taught to elementary school students, though not to students in junior high or high school. Now, perhaps we can agree with Glazer that truth is not the only criterion for judging what might be taught in the social sciences, but surely falsehood ought not to be allowed on any grounds. It does violence to what ought to be the historian's central concern, recovering the authenticity of the past, the pastness of the past. We should never commit what the great French historian Marc Bloch said was called the most unpardonable of sins, anachronism. Now, I'm not suggesting that history has no connection to the present. I'm not advocating that history become antiquarianism. Quite the contrary. It's natural for historians to want to relate the past to the needs and problems of our present. Indeed, historical explanation is only possible because we today have different perspectives from those of the historical participants that were writing about. Most new historical investigations begin with an attempt to understand the historical circumstances that lie behind a present-day problem or a present-day situation. So it's not surprising that our best recent work on the origins and nature of slavery coincided with the civil rights movement of the 1960s, or that our rich investigations into the history of women grew out of the women's movement of the past 3 or 4 decades. This is as it should be. The problems and issues of the present should be the stimulus for our forays into the past. It's natural for us to want to discover the sources, the origins of our present circumstances. But the present should not be the criterion for what we find in the past. Our perceptions and explanations of the past should not be directly shaped by the issues and problems of our own time. And the best and most serious historians have come to know that, even when their original impulse to write history came from a pressing present problem. The best and most sophisticated histories of slavery and the best and most sophisticated histories of women soon broke loose from the immediate demands of the present and have sought to portray the past in its own context, with all of its complexity. The more we study events and situations in the past, the more complicated and complex we find them to be. The impulse of the best historians is always to penetrate ever more deeply into the circumstances of the past and to explain the complicated context of past events. The past and the hands of an expert historian becomes a foreign country where they do things differently. A complicated world that requires considerable historical imagination to recover with any degree of accuracy. Now, I have to concede there's a downside to too much historical consciousness. Too much of this emphasis on the complexity of human affairs does have its own dangers, its own unanticipated consequences. Take the leaders of the American Revolution, for example. All of the major leaders, Jefferson, Adams, Washington, believed that the English ministry was involved in a conspiracy, a calculated design, a conspiracy to deprive them of their liberties. Now, historians since then have subsequently found that this was not the case. They may have been stupid, the British ministers, they may have been mistaken, but they were not conspiring to deprive the Americans of their liberties. But this false belief that Americans had in a conspiracy was what geared them up to act as they did and to sustain themselves through their long fight. Only with such a fear, only with such a mistaken sense of reality, could they mobilize themselves and their followers to take their bold step into revolution. Now, some American patriots didn't have that kind of false belief in a British conspiracy. They had, you might say, a more accurate view of reality, maybe a clearer sense of history. John Dickinson, for example, had been the most prominent patriot up to 1775. He was supplanted by Thomas Paine, but up to that point he was the man that everybody knew was the great Pennsylvania farmer. But he had an historical sensibility and did not believe, had, I think, a good historical sensibility, and did not believe that the British were conspiring against American liberties. And he warned his colleagues in the Continental Congress that America would bleed from every vein if it cut its ties to England, the source of its liberty. He was an intelligent, a rational man who actually perceived reality more accurately than his colleagues. He doubted the existence of evil intentions, and in the end, he hesitated to act. He failed to sign the Declaration of Independence, and he destroyed his historical reputation. Equally clear-sighted about the imperial crisis was the Boston minister Andrew Eliot, whose reputation, like that of Dickinson, was irreparably injured by his inability to commit himself to the revolutionary movement. Eliot was reasonable, tolerant, cautious, indecisive, because he knew too much and saw the complexity of affairs. He could not accept absolute conclusions, either intellectual or political. He insisted on seeing both sides of every major issue, and he always refused to decide anything unequivocally. We might say that he too had too keen a historical sense. Although, like Dickinson, Eliot was sympathetic to the American cause, he knew that the break from England would bring terrible and unanticipated consequences, and thus he hesitated, and the revolution passed him by. It is possible we may be mistaken, he wrote. Things may appear very differently to others as upright as ourselves, and the same desirable effect may be produced by sentiments not in every respect consonant to ours. Now, the cases of Dickinson and Eliot show that reasonableness, clear thinking, accurate perceptions of reality, in other words, too sharp a historical consciousness, are not necessarily what are needed to make a revolution, or perhaps even to get anything done at all. The distinguished historian Richard Hofstadter grasped this point near the end of his career, his life, nearly a half century ago. He pointed out the dangers of having too deep a historical sense, being too historically conscious. The great fear that animates the most feverishly committed historians, wrote Hofstadter, is that our continual rediscovery of the complexity of social interests, the variety of roles and motives of political leaders, the unintended consequence of political actions, the valid interests that so often have been sacrificed in pursuit of other equally valid interests, all of this may give us not only a keener sense of the structural complexity of our society in the past, but also a sense of the moral complexity of social action that will lead us towards political immobility. In other words, we get to know too much to act. Understanding the complexity of human affairs, seeing clearly both sides of all issues, knowing that few things work out the way we intend, may breed in us the same caution and indecisiveness that John Dickinson and Andrew Eliot displays. Imbued with a strong historical sense, we're apt to become one of Nietzsche's historically minded men who could not shake themselves, as Nietzsche said, could not shake themselves free from the delicate network of their truth and righteousness for a downright act of will. Which is why Nietzsche believed that forgetfulness is a property of all action. Too much rumination, these are terms he used, too much historical sense, he wrote, injures and finally destroys the living thing, be it a man, or people, or a system of culture. In other words, he said, if you want to be a man on horseback, better forget history. We Americans are probably not likely to develop too great historical sense. It runs against the American grain. It tends to dampen the can-do, the conquer-the-future spirit that we Americans are prone to have. We want our history to be useful and manipulating the future. Indeed, maybe the sort of instrumentalist and present-minded approach to the past that's so common today is inherent in being an American. As the perceptive English historian, the late J.R. Pohl, who knew America well, once said, what one misses in America is that sense, inescapable in Europe, of the total, crumbled irrecoverability of the past, of its differentness, of the fact that it is dead. Maybe our instrumental view of the past is part of our American exceptionalism. And maybe for trying to get things done, that's a good thing. The inescapable boundaries of so the sense that we have these boundaries around our actions, that history has no immediate utility and is apt to remind us of our own powerlessness, of our own inability to control events and predict the future, is not something that comes as part of our nature. And this, I think, as I'm trying to suggest, may be our saving grace. It's our lack of historical consciousness that makes us such an optimistic and get-up-and-go country. All of our politicians talk about is their desire to change things. Change will of course occur, but it won't necessarily be quite what the political leaders expected or wanted. Now, I don't think there is much chance of our losing our optimism, our enthusiasm to change the world. But what I would like, I think, for us to have is a little more awareness of how difficult it is to change the world in a purposeful fashion. In other words, we need a deeper and fuller historical sensibility. We have such a thin and meager sense of history that I don't think we can get too much of it. What we need more than anything else is a sense of where we have come from and how we've become what we are, together with a greater sense of the limitations of life. This sort of historical sense will give us the best guide we'll ever have for groping our way into an unpredictable future. Thank you.